As you know, we have recently completed negotiation of our third national agreement with PATCO. These negotiations, conducted in a spirit of mutual respect and cooperation, resulted in one of the most comprehensive and meaningful collective bargaining agreements in the federal government. I intend to see that this cooperative spirit is continued by the FAA throughout the administration of the contract. I am committed to fostering an atmosphere in which both parties can continue building upon this relationship so that differences that may arise can be resolved expediently and professionally. I believe that it is essential for you to understand fully the changes that have been made to the collective bargaining agreement in these most recent negotiations. I think you will realize that they are for the good of all concerned. As this contract has evolved over the course of 3 negotiations, our relationship has also evolved and matured to a point where confidence, understanding, and respect form an integral part of our day-to-day relationship. I will do everything in my power to assure that this growth continues. Each of you can and must assist in this effort. And now, John Layden.
Thank you, Langhorne. The 1978 PATCO-FAA contract is the result of many hours of difficult and trying negotiations between the respective parties. The support of our membership during this trying period gave us the strength to ultimately put together what I perceive as the finest contract in the federal sector. I must also point out, however, that the present system itself has limitations because of the restrictive nature of the scope of bargaining available to us. And I hope that in the very near future, through legislative expansion, many of the areas in which we sought improvements but were not successful will be open to us. This joint taping should help resolve a major problem in our previous contracts, specifically variations in interpretation of contract language, which ultimately resulted in arbitration that was costly both to FAA and PATCO. We fully intend and expect FAA to live up to each and every article in this contract, but it is up to you, the membership, to make certain that you understand and comprehend fully the intent of the contract language. The resultant contract, which was ratified overwhelmingly by our membership, is the result of compromise on both sides. The luxury we presently enjoy of being the preeminent federal employee union, having the best federal contract, will only continue to be the case if you continue to monitor and enforce the gains which were obtained in the 1978 contract. 2 of the most significant advances in federal sector collective bargaining which were obtained for you are the availability of national bidding using a seniority system for in-grade, downgrade bidding. This gives an opportunity for many of our controllers to obtain long overdue and long sought transfers within the ATC system. Additionally, the expanded overseas FAM trip program gives all controllers the opportunity to utilize jump seat privileges for overseas trips in recognition of their important and necessary contribution to the air traffic industry. And I fully expect the members of the industry to honor our contract and agreement with FAA DOT.
We have assembled members of the negotiating teams of FAA and PATCO, the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization, to review and discuss the recently negotiated labor agreement. The team members will describe the changes and additions to the agreement and provide you with the authoritative interpretation of the articles. Representing PATCO, we have Robert Poli, Executive Vice President. David Trick, Director of Operations. Michael Rock, Director of Labor Management Relations. Carl Vaughn, PATCO Negotiating Team, Eastern Region. Representing the FAA are Lauren Kirking, Chief Phoenix Tracon. John Matson, Assistant Chief, Air Traffic Division, Southwest Region. Glenn Tigner, Deputy Director, Air Traffic Service. And Edward Curran, Director of Labor Relations.
What you're about to see, I believe, is another first in the Federal Service in the way of joint briefings by the union and the management on a new labor agreement. Today we'd like to cover the highlights of the new agreement, explain these changes, and give you as much background as possible on each article. Before we proceed, though, I'd like to ask Bob Poli to say a couple of words as to why we're here.
Thank you, Ed. We are here because we feel that this is the third agreement that we've negotiated with the FAA. We feel for the facility reps that we represent and for the membership that this briefing will give you an in-depth understanding, we will attempt to give you an in-depth understanding as to actually what was discussed at the bargaining table and the meaning of each article as it was explained at the bargaining table. We're anxious to proceed with this, and we hope that it'll assist you in the performance of your job. And if you're ready to go to Article 1, Ed?
I think that's a good statement, Bob. I think we ought to emphasize that we can't possibly answer every possible question that might arise with you people that are working with this contract on a day-to-day basis, but we are going to try to cover as much as possible, and we're just going to have to depend upon you, the managers and the facility reps, to do the best you can to implement this contract in the way that both parties wanted it and intended it to be implemented while we were negotiating. So with that, let's take a look at Article 1, Section 2. It's really a relatively minor change, but we did add operations officers, EPDOs, and military liaison officers as elements of the employer, in addition to the other officials listed in that section. And that, as I recall, was done primarily for clarification purposes.
It just shows the management officials and points them out in the contract. There's no other changes.
Okay, so that shouldn't be a problem for anyone. Article 2, there were some relatively major changes in this article, and I'm going to ask Glenn Tigner to mention what those changes are, and particularly sections 15, 16, and 17. I would like to make a point on section 2 of that article. We took the existing agreement and eliminated from that section 2 facilities that had previously been excluded. One was Tulsa, Oklahoma, and the other Fairbanks, Alaska. And I'm going to ask Bob or one of his people to track me on this one, but Fairbanks is definitely in the bargaining unit now.
That is correct.
Tulsa, at this time, is not in the bargaining unit, but probably will be when the bar expires later this year, and there probably will be an election.
When the bar expires at the end of this year, they will become part of the bargaining unit, and that was the reason that when the contract was negotiated that we discussed Tulsa, because we felt with the length of the contract that they would be included before it expired.
Okay, fine. Let me ask Glenn to mention sections 15, 16, and 17, and say a few words about those.
Sure, Ed. You know, because of several questions that have come up with respect to what happens to the permanent successor to the facility rep, well, we merely added this to section 15 to clarify that the successor to the facility rep was entitled to 8 hours of excused absence to receive orientation on the articles of this agreement. It's as simple as that. Section 16 and 17 tend to tie together. But 16 is a recognition that the facility rep, the principal facility rep, needs some time to prepare for meetings. If he's going to do a good job, he needs some time that he can devote to us. So to the extent that we can release him from duty, we'll give him 4 hours a week of official time to prepare for these meetings. We wouldn't pay for any overtime under that, but this should assist the union in putting their act together. Now, on a one-time basis, we think it's reasonable, and section 17 really reflects it, that he can accrue 16 of those 4 hours, and he doesn't have to earn them in advance necessarily, so that he can go to the PATCO representative school, and that's the only occasion in which those 4 hours could become cumulative. He'd have official time to go to the school. We wouldn't pay any of the travel or per diem. And we would hope, we would expect that he'd give us some advance notice so that we could plan our scheduling around it. And that's really the gist, and that's an important article, and those are important section changes.
I think for the benefit of the managers that are going to be viewing this tape, they're not too familiar with the PATCO facility rep school, but you might want to say a word just about what it is and what you're doing with it.
The PATCO Facility Rep School is a new school that we have instituted after our last convention. Our first class was in November of this year. It's located in Silver Spring, Maryland. It is a school of 5 days in duration, where we brief our facility reps on labor history, the history of PATCO, in an attempt to bring them up to date of what a labor union, how the labor union started, how the structure of labor unions in the initial stages, how they came to be, our affiliation with MEBA, association with the AFL-CIO, and the contract itself and how to file grievances, unfair labor practices, in an attempt to become a better facility rep. So far, we've had about 8 classes go through, and we've received some very, very encouraging comments from our members on the school.
That sounds a bit like the counterpart of what we call our recurrent labor relations training at MTS, where supervisors go through there and they get some of the same thing. We don't teach them on how to file grievances, but we do try to give them that other background.
In some cases, that's an integral part of a facility rep's job.
Yeah, but I guess you're not trying to teach him to file grievances, are you? Saying when you have a legitimate type grievance, here's how you process it so that it's
no, Glenn, it's not our attempt to instruct people that grievances should be filed all the time, but it is our intent to show the individual, when he asks questions or in explanations of this contract or in the duties that he performs, what is a violation, what his rights are as a facility rep, and how the facility should be run and the rights of the union.
Yeah, that ties in with a point I'd like to make for the management people here. Most of them know it, if not all of them. It's management's job to administer this contract, and it's the union's job to police how that contract is administered, so that when they see that or feel or believe that you're not administering it properly, you're very likely to get a grievance, and that's their right and their obligation. And in that manner, hopefully the agreement will be properly applied. Do you have anything else you want to say on that Article 2?
Not particularly. Mike, do you have any?
No, I believe Mr. Tigner's explanation is about correct. Almost exactly 15, 16, and 17, those sections are the paramount changes. And because we have a 3-year agreement, we expect most of our locals have 1 or 2-year terms, and the gentleman or lady that replaces the current president will have the opportunity to get his 8 hours about the contract.
Okay, that sounds good to me. Let's see, Article 3, there was no change, and 4, no change. Article 5 is the next very, very major change, in my opinion, and I'd like the people viewing this tape to look at Article 5, Article 12, and Article 20 in sort of as a group, because they all kind of connect with each other. But basically, Article 5 was not changed. We added a section to it that provided that the parties at the national or regional level are governed by the procedures in Article. You have to look at Articles 5, 12, and 20 as sort of a package. And the basic purpose of these articles is to provide a mechanism for communications between the parties during the life of this contract. They're good articles. They're sort of a new concept in the federal service, in that issues arising under these articles could culminate in arbitration. But the basic purpose of them is to provide a mechanism so that the parties will be in constant communications during the life of the contract. Does that fairly capture that, Bob, as you see it, or Dave, or Mike, or Carl?
Well, yes, I think, Ed, that's a fairly accurate assessment of the overall structures of Articles 5, 12, and 20, but I would like to speak for a second to the intent of the articles. There has been a continuing controversy between PATCO and the FAA at nearly all levels for some time as to the semantics of how the parties are to deal with each other at the respective levels, whether it was consult, whether it was meet and confer, whether it was negotiate, or what. Actually focusing on that purely technical issue is, to a great degree, somewhat of an unfortunate set of circumstances. Setting that difference aside for a second, I think both parties agree that the underlying purpose of both Articles 5, 12, and 20 is that the parties must deal with each other in a responsible, good faith manner. They must be above board and deal straight with each other at all levels. And the articles envision that there will be disagreements when that happens, as there will be between any two parties trying to persuade on differing points of view. And Articles 12 and 20 provide a mechanism for elevating those disagreements to higher levels of the respective parties for review, with the possible culmination, excuse me, in binding arbitration.
Okay, I think that's correct, and I certainly agree with your point that we shouldn't focus so much on whether this is consult, meet and confer, negotiate, or whatever the real technical terms are. I certainly agree with your point that the parties at each level and at all levels have got to deal with each other openly and in good faith, and when there are disagreements, as you suggest there will be, as long as we both sides act responsibly, then there's a mechanism for getting those differences of opinion resolved. I mentioned earlier in this tape that this tape was probably a first in the federal sector. It's my view, in looking at Articles 5, 12, and 20, that that's another first that both PATCO and the FAA can point to in the way of providing a communications mechanism during the term of this contract that should enable us to avoid any major difficulties. And it'll be interesting to see how it works. Some observers in labor relations have said, well, what is that process? I have responded by saying essentially what Dave Trick has said, that it's a mechanism for communicating, and we want it to work, and we're going to try our best to make it work. And we're sure that PATCO will want the same thing.
I think, Ed, also that parties should understand the significant change in Section 2, where we deal with the local level. I believe it's the intent of the parties that if local management intends or wants to change a local personnel policy, that he will call in the PATCO representative, sit down, explain the reasons why the change is needed, and see if he can get the union's view whether the change or perhaps some other suggestions. And that if the change, there is a disagreement between the parties at the local level, if the change is not really necessary to be implemented immediately, there's no compelling reason that the status quo would continue until we have exhausted the procedures in Article 5, 12, and 20. But if there was a compelling reason for operational requirements, so then perhaps we could expect management at the local level to implement that change without waiting for the whole process. Does that about capture what the intent of management is also?
I believe that's essentially correct, Mike. But I'd like to ask Glenn to comment on that. But before I do that, let me make my own comments. That if I, as a manager, want to change something, and the union has a serious problem with that change, I would certainly pause at that point and say, well, you know, must I really make this change at this point, or can I wait until it can be massaged some more? And as a manager, again, I would not just go ahead and make that change, particularly if it was going to upset the whole workforce. So I think I agree. In fact, I agree with what you said, essentially. Unless there's some compelling reason to proceed with that change, then I would wait until the process is worked out and the whole process is finished. Does that sound fair to you, Glenn?
Yeah, I think what we're saying, it's a question of the rule of reason. I mean, if it's a necessary action that the chief feels there's a necessity for implementing, it's conceivable that he could, in that rare instance, do that. But I think the rule of reason says, hey, let's hold off till we can settle this thing one way or the other. And I don't really see a situation very often where we would implement a proposed policy where it was in dispute.
I think that's essentially right. It just makes good sense, you know, that let's not do something, let's not change something just simply because we have the right to change it. And let's, you know, if it's going to upset everybody, if there's a question about whether that change should be made, let's get that resolved first before taking any action. And I think, as Glenn says, there may be a rare instance where it's necessary to go ahead and implement something, but that should be a rare instance.
Yeah,
basically, Ed, I agree, and the question that Mike asked has always been a big question for us because it was changed in this particular contract and discussed at the table. The other big change in this particular article is the fact that the possibility exists that this case may go to arbitration on something that is a dispute at the local level. Now, there has been questions as to the use of this particular arbitration procedure, and I think it would be fair for you to emphasize to the viewers that during these discussions that the administrator himself has said and given his commitment that this procedure will be used.
Oh, I think that's correct. In fact, I'm sure we're going to use this procedure, but I'd like to throw this out for both sides that are watching this tape and even at this table. We have a very comprehensive national agreement, and it's one I think both parties can be proud of to start with. It covers many, many things. So while I envision that we'll be going to arbitration, I don't see us going there every day, you know, over every little issue that comes up. In the first place, it's a terribly expensive process, and I don't think it was the intent of either party that we were just going to toss everything into an arbitrator. But it will be used. I've tried to think of some examples that might fit, but frankly, the national agreement is so comprehensive that I have trouble finding examples. But I guess the bottom line, the answer to your question is yes, it will be used.
Carl, do you have
Just that the similar statements were made at the table, what was said right here just now.
Yeah, if we had a couple of days to talk about arbitrations in general, we could spend a lot of time on tape. Both sides, I'm sure, you're well aware, we're spending a lot of money on it, and that's a whole separate subject. But you're right, Bob, it will be used. Okay, before we go on, I think maybe the people watching this tape would be interested in the fact that here in Oklahoma City with us, we have some other members of the bargaining teams that they'll be seeing a little bit later on the tape. And would you like to introduce?
Sure. From our side, we have Larry Weisenhut, the Southwest Region negotiator in the National Negotiating Team, who will be on the panel and interchange with members from our side here very shortly.
Okay, and from our side, we have Joe Noonan, who is chief of the Union Management Relations Division in my office and who is a member of the team, and I'm going to ask Joe to talk with you about some specific articles a little bit later in this night. So with that, why don't we take a break?